Your travels should lead you here to the corner of 5th and Congress Avenue. This is what the intersection looks like today. Congress Avenue has always been the hub of our city, the main street. This is where the early settlers lived and worked, right off this intersection. And so this is what the building looks like today. But it didn't always look like this. We're going to look at a few historic shots, and then we're going to tell the story about a young man. This is the same intersection looking south. Here's the building here in question. This is the CVS pharmacy today, looking from what would be 6th and Congress, looking south. You can see it's a dirt street back in the day. Again, here's another picture of the corner when it was a different store. And yet again here you can see that back in the day, this was dirt roads. There was a ditch along the road here, and then a little bridge that people would walk over. So this is back in the day when they didn't have air conditioning. Everything was pretty miserable here in Austin. And our story is going to start off in 1884 about a young man who stayed out all night drinking and possibly doing other drugs. Drugs were very common back then. As I'm going to show you in this next slideshow, you could go to the store and buy cocaine, heroin, just about anything else. So here's the story of James Hall. James was one of the best known characters in Austin. He was somewhat eccentric in his conduct, but with all he was a man for whom nearly all who knew him had a kindly feeling for. He was social and generous to a fault, and not many men had fewer enemies than he. He came to Austin when he was a mere lad, and he lived here since. He was a florist by profession, and one of the most skillful in the South. Mr. Hall had been drinking nearly all night, and perhaps indulging in other dispensation, until his mind was so completely clouded and unstrung that he had little or no control of himself. About 7, this being the morning of March the 9th, 1884, he met his uncle on Congress Avenue, and the uncle began to upbraid him for being out all night, saying he ought to have been home with his family. James replied that he was ashamed, and that he was going to stop it. He and his uncle then parted. Later, in some unknown manner, James procured some morphine and took a very heavy dose of the stuff. About 8 o'clock, a man was walking down the avenue, yes, that's Congress Avenue, and saw James drop to the sidewalk. He called the police, and James was taken to his home. A doctor was summoned, who at once detected morphine poisoning. He applied the antidotes known to science, but the effects of the drug had gone too far, and James died after laying comatose in his state for some time. Mr. Hall was a married man with a family in his 38th year when he died, and his funeral was largely attended. We're here at Oakwood Cemetery at 16th and Navasota, and just inside of these historic iron gates lies the final resting place of James Hall. Here in the original old part of the cemetery, right off of Main Street, is a family plot. It measures a little bit bigger than the rest, and here's where you find the final resting place of James Hall. What's interesting is not one gravestone marks any of the burials. Here we have over 22,000 people buried, and 49% are lacking a headstone, either because the material that was used back in the day has not survived the weather and the time, or perhaps the family couldn't afford a headstone. But here at Oakwood Cemetery, in this grass patch underneath, lies the remains of James Hall.